I hope we're having a good morning if you're in the US, I guess evening or afternoon and evening if you're in Europe, and then late night if you're over in Asia or Australia in those areas. So welcome to the webinar. Let me continue a slide here. And of course, managing information security risk with the CIS controls. That's what we'll be talking about today. And my name is Brian Ventura. I will be your guide with this conversation. I am the course author for the 566 course, which does go over the CIS controls. And so some of this material is coming from the actual course material. So that'll be good to show us what is in there and how we kind of talk about the controls themselves. So little bit about me. So I've been in the industry for about 30 years, hence, the gray hair. I have 20 plus on the screen. I've been with SANS, teaching with SANS for about 8 years. So I started out with the CIS controls were the first course that I took. And then, of course, I've taken other SANS courses and things like that, but really enjoyed working with the CIS controls, work with them in my private practice. I'm a consultant, come into organizations, help them out with how to implement programs, build out solutions, and potentially use the CIS controls or audit themselves to another control framework. So I do a bunch of work in the CIS controls, as well as the cybersecurity framework is another area. Since I'm in the US, it tends to be a common control framework that people talk about. So in addition to SANS, I've worked in the industry. I started out as a Unix administrator, so kind of a technical background, but then about a decade ago, switched into information security as an architect, and then moved on to managing teams and things like that. Again, do a lot with the CIS controls, and then I also teach the Management 512 course, the Security Leadership Essentials. So that's a little bit about me. I'm in Oregon, Portland, Oregon. So I'm on the west coast of the United States, and we're having a nice, cool October. Had a good Halloween last night. Had a pretty good amount of kids come over to get candy and such. So that was kind of fun. But let me go ahead and jump in here and we'll see where we end up. Now, as I go through this webinar, as I go through this conversation, I do want it to be more of a conversation than just a lecture from me. So feel free to post any questions that you may have in the Q&A section. So we have a Q&A. If you go up to your Zoom controls, you'll find Q&A. Feel free to post questions in there. I'll see those and I'll find a breaking point and answer the questions. I'll try to answer them as we go along, just to make them relevant to what we're talking about. However, at the end, I also have a question and answer section. So if you want to hold them to the end, that's understandable as well. But again, the Q&A section is the best way to post your questions, and I will answer them in audio so that we can all talk about them and things like that. So again, the Q&A, as you wish, put questions in there. I'm going to try to answer them as I go along. All right, so thinking about why I'm having this conversation, why the CIS controls, what's the problem that we're trying to solve? And if we think about or just look at the industry right now, we can go out and we can look at what's going on in the industry over the last few weeks, few months, and we can see that organizations are getting breached. I think I saw recently that there's about 500 ransomware events per year, successful ransomware events where they're making money. And if you think about 500 or 600 of them, that means there's at least one a day. So there's absolutely a need or a problem that's happening out there. Organizations are getting broken into. They're breaching data. The adversaries are breaching data out of these organizations. Some of that is personally identifiable data, and we get hurt with things like GDPR and things like that. But also we have other regulations and other goals to keep this data protected. You know, PCI if it's credit card information. In the US, you have HIPAA if you're in the healthcare world trying to protect this data. We're supposed to be protecting this data, but yet it keeps getting out there on the adversaries exfiltrating it, getting on the dark web, whatever that is. And so we see that there's a problem. On the other side, we can look at the industry and say, well, are there any tools that'll help us out? And we can see that, well, yes, there's tons of tools. Every vendor out there has the solution that will solve all the security problems. And every few years, or every year or so, we have a different buzzword that will solve all our problems. And I think large learning models are our topic of the day or the year. And you know, ChatGPT and those kinds of solutions, they're going to solve all our problems. And before that, it was machine learning and artificial intelligence. So we kind of flowed into that. But we talk about zero trust will solve all our problems. If we can just get to zero trust, we won't have any of these breaches happening. And we go back further, and well, the blockchain was going to solve all the problems. And so we went over that. So there's a lot of technologies out there. And the technologies are great. They're doing what they say that they're going to do. They're helping us out. But do we have the right ones? And do we have proper coverage? Well, again, I look at the industry and I say, well, lots of tools available, robust tools, powerful tools for protection, detection, response. All of these things are covered. I look at the adversaries, and yet the adversaries are still breaking in. So somewhere there's a disconnect. Maybe we should come back to basics and think about where we can put the controls to be most effective, instead of what's the latest buzzword, what's the latest thing that everybody wants. Now, to be fair, our networks are very complex. And we traditionally were on premise, and maybe it was easier because we could control everything. And now we're hybrid, or we're hybrid cloud, or we're in the cloud, and that makes it more confusing. Maybe we're multi-cloud, we're using multiple services. Our data is getting into a lot of places that traditional architecture, go back 20 years, didn't account for. And maybe it was easier, but then again, on premise, it was very difficult to make change. In the cloud, we can change a little more dynamically. On premise, we might have had more flatter networks. We didn't have the segmentation we wanted. In the cloud, we could have built into that. So still, yes, the ecosystem, it's complex, it's more complex than in the past, but also we should be getting better at this because of those excellent tools that are available. Now, if I'm thinking about proving this out, you know, thinking about what kinds of problems are out there, just to give a snapshot of what's out there, thinking about in the US, the Federal Bureau of Investigations, if there is a problem that someone wants law enforcement help with, they might post to this annual crimes complaint, the ICC, and they can apply, or they can record their issue, and then the FBI will choose to help them if they can or not. Well, these complaints get put onto this website. We get a list of them, anonymized. FBI puts this out every year or so. And here we're looking at a snapshot. So we're looking at 5 years. Doesn't matter which 5 years we're looking at, but we're looking at a very recent 5 years. I believe they just came out with their 2022 information, so I missed it, but I will get it on here. But this idea that in the last 5 years, is it getting better or is it getting worse? And we can say, okay, well, I see that it was 300,000 complaints in 2017, and then I come down to 2022 and it's nearly tripled, right? We've got almost 3 times the amount of complaints, the amount of people reporting something. And then the damages that are caused by that, I can see that we started out at 1.4 billion, but we're up to almost 7 billion, which is more than 4 times the more expensive, these breaches, these incidents, whatever we're going to call these. So we can see that not only are there more of them being successful, there's also more damages caused by these. And there's lots of reasons for this. We use our systems much more heavily. We rely on them more. They are getting more complex, but again, we're not keeping up with the information security side of things. Now, the other thing to think about with this wonderful chart that I give you, yes, this is what the FBI sees. Do they see everything? Do they even see everything inside the United States? No, not at all. They only see the ones where people are required to report or people choose to report. If you don't choose to report, you don't have a requirement to report, you can just take the hit of being breached in whichever way it happened to you, whether it's ransomware, whether it's actual data being stolen, whether it's a mixture of those, whatever it is, they do not have to report as long as it doesn't hit regulated data of some sort or some compliance arena. And so we've got just a snapshot here. And then if I go global, I say, okay, wait a minute, is the FBI even seeing anything happening outside of the United States? Not really. Not if it's not affecting Americans, then they're not going to get the report. Or even if they get the report, it probably wouldn't end up on this list because it doesn't make sense for them. So we can see that it's getting worse in the US. I think that's a mirror of everywhere else in the world. This information security thing is a problem. Okay. So maybe I've sold John and, started out easy. We'll sell this. Let's see where we go from here. Well, on the other side now, the whole point of this is we should have a solution for this. We should come up with a way of defending ourselves so that we don't have these breaches, so that we can reduce the numbers or at least keep to a steady state. I mean, heck, we're getting more and it's almost exponential. If we could just keep it the same, that would be a huge benefit for us. And some smart people thought about this. And it started out from some government agencies in the United States. Then SANS found out about it and started publicizing these controls, and they became the SANS Top 20. And then they've gone along and changed names. They're the critical security controls. Now they're the CIS critical security controls. And SANS gave the controls over to the Center for Internet Security. So Center for Internet Security is now the home of the CIS controls, or the critical security controls, and they're just maintaining them and keeping them moving forward. Many of the people that have been involved are still involved in this. Now I have a question, so I'll go ahead and break off and read the question. If the data is on-prem, the company is responsible for security. In the cloud, we have to rely on vendor for most of the controls. Why should we do that? That's an interesting one. And you're getting into this area, James, thank you, of the shared responsibility. So if I'm in the cloud, if we're in the cloud, what am I responsible for? And I'm going to still say that as the organization, as the owner of the data, I have a responsibility out there. I have to manage the access to those files, the data, and then the data itself. So there is still an ownership. I still have controls that I need to put in place. But then to your point, some of the controls, physical security as a big example, I'm handing over to this third party and the cloud provider. And the idea there is maybe there's going to be an economy of scale. They're going to be able to do it for less expensive across all customers, and therefore I will spend less money. And we can argue that based on what we spend for on-premise, but we got to think about all the hidden costs like having a data center in the first place. But anyways, that's one side. The other side of that though is that they may do better with some of those security things. They may be able to offer us additional services that we couldn't afford on premise. So on premise, every security solution is $100,000, and I buy a box and I install the box. In the cloud, I spend a couple dollars a day, and it's not hopefully as expensive as those hundreds, thousands, $1 million things that I bring in on premise. So I'm sharing the responsibility, and then you and I have to have a risk conversation of, is it responsible for us to put it in the cloud? There's a benefit, but there's also detriments that maybe it's more accessible from the rest of the world. So good questions. And why are we relying on a vendor? Hopefully they can do it less expensive. Hopefully they can give us better security as well as features that we couldn't get on premise due to cost. So that would be my easy answer for that kind of a question. Yeah. So, but yes, the data is ours. We've got to handle that ourselves. There's definitely always a responsibility because we're the ones that are engaging with our customer. We chose to put our stuff in the cloud, so we have to take on that ownership of that. All right. So back to the CIS, or Center for Internet Security. SANS had been carrying the CIS controls for a long time prior to giving them to CIS, and found that the industry said, well, maybe we need a nonprofit to own it. So we handed it over to the Center for Internet Security. They handle a number of things, including security benchmarks. So if you wanted to have secure configurations, you can get those from CIS. They're free to get in PDF form. You do have to become a member if you want to have the GPOs that you can just apply immediately to devices. And those benchmarks cover more than just the operating systems. And then the CIS controls, and then they also manage one of the information sharing and analysis centers, the multi-state information sharing analysis center, for those of us that might have worked in the state, local government world. So state, local, tribal, territorial, SLTT, those are all members or have the ability to become members of the MS-ISAC and get a lot of really good resources through that sharing center. So CIS is doing some really awesome things. Some of their tools are you have to pay for, but the CIS controls are free. The benchmarks, the PDF versions are free. So highly recommend people do leverage more than just the CIS controls from them. But since I'm talking about the CIS controls, let's look at them. So here's the latest version, version 8. It's been around for a couple of years now. We're always thinking about yet the next version. Where should we be going with this? But for now, we've got the 18 controls. And these are really control families. So inside of these, there's many things that we want you to do. But we start out with these 8 groupings of things that we want to do. Previously, you may have heard of it as the SANS Top 20, and it was 20 controls for a very long time. This is the first version that we've deviated from 20 controls. We've always said we could, and we finally did. And basically what we've done is we reordered and shuffled some of the safeguards that are inside of these controls and combined a few is really what happened. So we didn't really take away things, we added things, but moved them around is really what happened with version 8 from version 7. And we continue to do that. Each version, we're going to shuffle things because we're looking at what's the most important things for us to take care of today, right now, to fix problems. That's our goal, one of our big goals. So here are the controls. You know, we can go into detail on each one of them, but we don't have enough time for that. But they are in a prioritized order, so that first control, in inventory of all of our enterprise assets, we should know all the hardware on our network. In the control 2, we should know about all the software. And maybe we should only allow that hardware and that software to run on our systems or in our network ecosystem. So that we can go through each of these controls, but these first 2 are foundational. They're very important for us to start out because without these, we're not going to be able to put all the rest of our controls. And you'll see the data protection. We got to get an inventory and understanding of all of our data as well. So we go through the controls. We continually think about what controls should be in here, what safeguards, and how we should handle those. But let's dig in a little bit deeper on these. So one of the things we've noticed is we need a priority to go through these controls. And one of the ways that we can do that is with implementation groups. And so we've created these implementation groups as both a prioritization, but also a sizing. I've had lots of people come up to me and say, hey, I want to use the CIS controls. I'm in the class, or I'm using them, but we only have this many resources. So how much of the controls should we do? How many should we be able to do? Because I can't do all of them. They're too expensive. And so we've looked at them and said, you know what? The core and most important things for you to do, that's implementation group 1. So if you could go ahead and do implementation group 1 to start, that would be a great starting point. And smaller organizations, you should be able to handle this. Think about 100 people or less. You should be able to handle that. As we mature, though, as we continue on implementing these controls, getting better with these controls, because we can't turn them all on in the same day. So we're going to, iterate through these. As we go through, we say, okay, I finished implementation group 1. I'm a larger organization, maybe a medium-sized organization. I'm going to move into implementation group 2. Enterprises will move into implementation group 2. They'll do more of the controls, a little bit more sophisticated controls, a little bit better protections. And then as you move forward with this, you move into implementation group 3, those enterprises over 5,000 people in your organization, you're doing the whole thing. If you're around 1,000 people in your organization, you might stop at implementation group 2, but implementation group 3 finishes out all the controls. So implementation group 3 includes 2 and 1. Implementation group 2 includes 1. And so you're building upon those things. And this is a priority. So out of those 18 controls, some of each of those controls are in implementation group 1. And then more is in implementation group 2. And then we finish out in implementation group 3. So hopefully that's a good way to go through these. Let me see, I got a question here. Not getting caught up on buzzwords. Okay, so that was just a comment, so thank you for that. And then, Harold has a question though. Network infrastructure management is number 12. Wouldn't that be a bigger priority? And we did have that problem. If we do just look at the order, control 1 is more important than control 12. But then we say, well, wait a minute though. We want to know about the network as well. And 12 is where we switch from more system level to network level. And that's where the implementation groups come in. And they say, do a little bit of control 1, a little bit of control 2, do a little bit of control 12. And then let's iterate and do more of control 1 and control 12, et cetera. And so that's how we end up doing all the controls at the same time, essentially, but we do get that focus. And I agree, control 12 is just as important as controls 1 and 2, getting those inventories. Let's do it on our network devices as well. So hopefully the implementation groups help us with that to be able to get that completed. Here's another way to look at it. Implementation group 1 at the bottom there, 56 things I need you to do. We're going to do the most important 56 things. It's going to include some of the network components, some of the system components. Then as we get a little bit more sophisticated, we're done with those 56, we're going to add 74 more. So we do the first 56 plus 74 more. And then as we get to that third, we're going to do 23 more and we finish it out. So in those families, total, there's 153 safeguards, 153 things we tell you to do. And each of these are equivalent, if we're looking at NIST 800-53, they're equivalent not only to your control number, but maybe even just one of those enhancements. So they're a little more granular than 800-53 if you're looking at that, but 153 things that we're going to tell you to do overall. And again, this is the breakdown into those groups. So thank you for the question. And there is an absolute mapping, and I'll show you that to get in between these back to 800-53 if that's an important thing to do for you, or any other framework. Now, continuing on, as we build out these controls, we started out with this community-based consensus. And this was a bunch of smart people like you and I coming together and saying, what's the most important thing we should do right now? If we're doing nothing else, what is the most important thing we should do? And we'd have a nice conversation or argument over what the priority is. And we'd have about 1,000 people having this conversation. And it was a good conversation because there's a lot of smart people out there, and we're looking at the industry. We're working with this every day. We can make good decisions. And at the time when we started with this, we didn't have any benchmark or something else to look at. We didn't have threat data out there available to us in an easy, consumable way. And so this is what we were left with. So then as we move along, the community defense model says, let's build on top of that. That consensus model is a great idea, but does it cover everything? Does it actually show that in the industry this is true? So we took threat data, specifically a lady at Center for Internet Security did this work, and she brought together some of that threat data to try to figure out, are the controls effective for you? Now, when we started out with the consensus model, we didn't have anything. And so it was just a bunch of smart people talking about stuff. But then we got some of these Lockheed Martin kill chains and things like that. So we started to leverage some of those. But now we can move into MITRE ATT&CK, which is a much better solution for kind of having this conversation. And so we looked at, Valencia specifically looked at this and said, hey, throughout the MITRE ATT&CK lifecycle, if we look at how the adversaries are coming in, they're going to do certain things. Here's some examples of things that they will do. Can we put controls in place to block and defend within this life cycle such that the adversary doesn't achieve their mission? And we specifically brought out a distinction that many of us consider we fail at the delivery phase or the exploit phase. As soon as the adversary gets a foothold on our network, we've lost. And we don't want you to think that way, because the adversary needs to accomplish their mission. Them being on your system is not a good day. But if you can get them off of your system before they achieve their mission of stealing your data, encrypting your data, whatever that is, we're in an okay spot. So instead, we need to stop them before they complete their mission. And so at least if we could detect them and deliver an exploit, if not block them, we can still achieve our mission of protecting our network. So went through all of these different MITRE ATT&CK things, specifically took each of the CIS safeguards, mapped them into specific attack mitigations, which then could map to the techniques that it's protecting against. So those adversaries have specific techniques that they're going through. They're going to try to do something. And so they're going to, phish us. And then they're going to do escalation of privilege. And then they're going to do, and each of those specific things, we mapped, or Valencia mapped the CIS controls into it. And then was able to map backwards and say, wait a minute, let's look at the most important adversarial things that are out there, and let's see what the controls do against that. So really good work here. And it came out to be, if you're just doing implementation group 1, if we look at the 5 most common attacks, malware, ransomware, web application hacking, insider or privilege misuse, and that targeted intrusion, we're getting about 75% or greater protection in that just from implementation group 1. Just looking at your network and noticing what's on there. As you get more sophisticated, we want you to get to implementation group 3. We see, by the way, the CIS controls as a low watermark. This is the bare minimum controls you're supposed to do, these 18 things, 153 safeguards, but you're going to do more than this. You're going to do that machine learning and all that fun stuff. I agree, but this is the basics. This will fill in those gaps and make it much harder for that adversary. So if we can get to implementation group 3, we get 90% and above of protection from the actual attacks that are happening today. So pretty powerful. And different ways to look at it. Hey, let's look at those specific technique areas and see what coverage we have. Green says IG1 has good coverage on that. Orange filling out the rest of that. And then gray, we're not covering that. We're not saying we're doing everything. CIS Controls does not do everything, but it does a lot. And that's what we're showing here. So there's still things that we might need to do, especially when we start to customize this for our industry, for our organization. What on top of the CIS controls will we do? That's where we fill in those extra gaps. Another way to look at it up above, we have this idea that, hey, look at this. Some of these controls, 4.1, 4.7, mitigate many techniques. So those are really powerful controls, and that's secure configuration if you're curious. So having a secure configuration is important. Having good user control and access control and need to know and all that, very important, meets a lot of the safeguards. So we can see that the controls are meaningful. They're making a difference. Something that I run into in class, people ask about it, where should I put these controls? Where do they fit? And basically the answer is everywhere. But just to lay it out, you got legacy computing, you're on-prem, you got those systems in the office, all of those, right? I want your workstations, I want your servers, I want all of your IoT devices, I want all of your cameras and your TVs and your thermostats, all of that stuff is part of our ecosystem and therefore part of our attack surface. We care about that. Networking communications, east and west versus north and south. North and south go into the internet, east and west going across my network, lateral movement. I want to notice it there too. I look at the different types of software. Oh, wow, I want this to happen at the operating system level. Many people think of it at that level, but I also need that application stack because that's where my data is. That's where the lot of my risk is. That's what I want to cover here. I need to do this on all my different platforms. Yes, that means my mobile devices. And then, of course, we've got that in the cloud. We've got infrastructure as code. We've got some of those cloud platforms, all of that as well. So just coverage everywhere, right? Okay, so what I've talked about the controls, I suggested where they came from, what can they do for you? Well, if I look generally, thinking about just the first few controls, we start out with know what's on your network. Find out an inventory of all your hardware assets and all your software assets, controls 1 and 2, and then only allow those devices to connect. Right there, I think that control 2, knowing what all your software is and doing application control, which is the ultimate technical thing we're saying to do in there, that's an extremely powerful control. The adversary needs to run software on your machine. If you won't let them run software that isn't on your list, they want to run malware, of course, or whatever their tools are, they won't run. That's a pretty powerful control. Can it be defeated? There are ways around it, but I've just made them have to jump through hoops and all those things, and maybe I'm going to detect them before they can get past the protection of application control. So right there, we're starting out at a powerful basis. Don't allow them to run any software that we don't authorize. And we only authorize the stuff that we've purchased, the stuff that makes sense for us to authorize, and therefore there's not this wiggle room for the adversary. There's a little bit of wiggle room because PowerShell might be on that list because you legitimately use it, and that's a pretty strong tool for the adversary, but how'd they get to be able to be at that prompt, right? And be at that PowerShell prompt. So we got some good controls in the starting. Notice that I already bring in control 12 with my second bullet and say, hey, only allow that hardware to run. Control 12 actually says from that inventory, only allow that to run with something like a network access control is what we're thinking about. So Eric brings up a really good question that I get all the time. Okay, application control, you said it's a really powerful control. It sounds great on paper, but is anybody really doing it in the real world? Because it's complicated, it's hard, there's lots of problems, it causes issues. Yes, I've seen it in production. And yes, I've seen it be successful. Are there problems with it? Yes, there are. You got edge cases where there's different pieces of software that are harder to get into your authorized list. My answer for it is generally start small and get bigger. With any of these solutions, I'm going to say that. And so get a test group, put them in the group, let them know they're in the group, let them work on this, finding some of these edge cases, put them in monitor mode, and then get better with this until you say, well, we're not getting a ticket every day to put in new software, so I think we can now switch over into that enforcing mode. And then there's some ways to do it with encryption, doing trusting publishers, which can make it easier to get those in place as well. But yes, finding some success with doing application control. As we continue, we're saying, hey, find out where all your data is and find out where it's supposed to be communicating. A lot of our problems is, hey, gigabytes went to the internet. How'd you not notice that? Because I didn't know where my data is supposed to flow. And so maybe that was a legitimate flow. Maybe that was a legitimate business purpose. And so we say, well, let's put some user behavior analytics to figure that stuff out because it's complex. Well, here we're saying maybe you should just look at where your data flows really are. Look at the software, look at the solutions, talk to the business units, document that, and then only allow those flows. And now you notice where the adversary is. There's a question of NAC specifically. NAC is more of a hardware solution in the view that I'm talking about here. NAC is a bigger solution than what I'm thinking about, but it's the way that everybody talks about it. And so network access control is really saying, I want to connect to the Wi-Fi. I want to plug into the network. It interrogates me in that moment and says, should you be on the network? Are you an authorized device? Do you have all your authorization things in place? Which could be things like, do you have your anti-malware and endpoint protection and endpoint detection and response turned on and doing the right thing? So a few different ways that we would do that, but NAC is more of a hardware solution, interrogating software to determine whether the hardware should connect. Yeah. So we collect all of our data, we understand where it's flowing, then we say, hey, let's have some removal of vulnerability, let's get some secure configuration, let's make sure we only allow the right people to get access to that, and then we can finish out with some of those things like third-party risks that we're having right now, right? That's a huge problem right now. We bought a software, we don't know what's in the software, we think it's awesome, and then some minor component gets a critical vulnerability, and we go to our vendor and say, when are you going to fix this? And it takes them a while to do so. So that's built into the CIS controls. So lots of things that we should be doing as we build this out. Most of these are basic things that all of us would agree are good ideas. We should know what's on our network. We should only allow those things. We should know where our data is. We should have controls around our data. We should remove vulnerabilities, etc. So they make sense. Now, this is a general view, a high-level view of the CIS controls. An interesting thing that came out about 3 weeks ago, maybe even 4 weeks ago now, the CISA, Center for, what is that? Infrastructure, Infrastructure and Security Agency, so in the United States, and then the National Security Agency, they put out a memo of the most common mitigations, top 10 cybersecurity mitigations. And they said this came from our blue team and our red team working together. So blue team defenders, red team attackers, your penetration testers, but internal people that are going to help you out. And so you got your defenders, you got your attackers, and they put them next to each other and said, hey, defenders, what are you noticing the adversary doing when they get into our network? Hey, on the red team side, your attackers, how do you break into networks? And they said these are the most common ways. So on the left, in that nice color of blue and red for the blue and red team, that's what they're doing. That's what they're seeing the adversary is doing, the most common problems that the adversary is getting in through. So these are things, sorry, that we've done incorrectly inside of our network such that the adversary can get in. There's a question, does CIS issue a security certification like ISO? Today, that is a no, but there is some conversation about certification inside of the CIS controls. There's a lot of measurement and metric built into it such that you can easily are able to show how well you're doing, and I'll show some of that in a bit. Yeah, so it's mainly publishing the good things to do, like a framework. It's not a full framework, but then there is measurement inside of that to ensure that you're doing it at the right level. If you're looking at assessment, I'll have some assessment tools in a moment. There are a couple different Excel and web-based solutions out there, so I'll get to that in a moment. Now, if I look at the things that the top mitigations here, default configurations, improper separation of administrative rights, I've mapped them to the different controls and how they fit. So we have secure configuration. We have restricting admin privilege and doing good role-based management of access and removing people's access as they move to different parts of the organization. Network monitoring, absolutely, both starting on the host side, but then going to the network side. There's actually a lot of power with moving our network-based monitoring down to the endpoint due to all that encrypted traffic we have. We're not really seeing inside the packets, and we shouldn't. We should be encrypted. And so you're going to have to move some of that stuff down to the host side of things instead of the network side. Segmentation been a huge problem. We got flat networks. The adversary can get through these things. Oh, that's bad. Okay, well, let's have that segmentation. We have it built into that. It's hard to do, especially retrofitting. That's where I look towards the cloud, and maybe we can get that separation as we move into the cloud because we're not getting it. We don't have as much data out there, or it's a newer solution, so it's ready to move around a little faster. But you can see the controls are in there. Patch management, absolutely. We need to patch. Get rid of your vulnerabilities. That's a whole nother area. Vulnerability management is huge, right? And how do we prioritize that and things like that? Again, weakness of MFA, we covered a little bit with our controls, secure configuration, as well as implementing. We don't talk about in the controls which MFA is better. For instance, text messaging, I'm going to say, is not a good solution. We don't call that out in the CIS controls because we're just saying any MFA is better than no MFA. And then we say, okay, you probably should get smart with that and choose, FIDO compliant, all that good stuff. More about controls as far as what access we get, and then even our unrestricted execution of code. Well, if we had that app control in place, maybe they wouldn't be able to execute that. So yeah, so you can see that it matches up towards some of the things that we're seeing as bad things happening on the internet. Okay, got a bunch of questions here. PowerShell, what are our thoughts on blocking PowerShell at the user level? The people that don't need it, highly recommend. If no one needs it, it's a very strong tool for the adversary. Turn it off for most people until your admins use it. Let them use it. Until your data scientists use it, let them use it. But sign those scripts. So something we can do with certificates. So that's where I would go with that. Any opinion on mitigating controls? We don't do that control specifically, but we do this. So we would want you to do the more powerful control, but sometimes we can't get it in place. And so we put another control in place. This is reducing our risk. All of our controls reduce risk. And so the powerful control, the one that we list, that's what we want you to do first because it reduces the most risk. But you can find one or two or many controls that give you sufficient reduction of risk. So that's reasonable to do. We'd have to talk about specific controls and why you can't do the primary with that. And then do I have a preference of whether to begin CIS controls or take it the other way around by scanning against the CIS benchmark, blessing what you already have, and then pass the work on the failed items so that you get to a certain level? Those are actually the same thing if you wanted to think about it that way. Starting with the CIS controls is going to be my answer because control 4 is that secure configuration. And so you're going to start doing that. Control 7 is scan for vulnerabilities. So just by starting the CIS controls at IG1, you're going to do a secure configuration. You're going to do vulnerability. Actually, you're going to do patch management at first because I really don't care about vulnerabilities. I care about removing the vulnerabilities. So scanning for vulnerabilities isn't the most important thing, but patching is. So I would say start with the CIS controls, and you'd see with IG1 that you're going to hit your other part of that, scanning for against a set of secure configurations. You're going to do that. All right, a couple more things with the controls. Lots of companion guides to help us out. How do you apply these in weird places like IoT devices? Like how do I meet my privacy? Things like that. Some of the things the adversaries are doing with that living off the land. Here's an example of just a mobile companion. We've got color coding per control telling us which ones would apply most of the control versus less of the control versus not at all. For instance, network management doesn't make sense on an endpoint, on a phone or things like that. So we get that help. It tells us really specific things that can help us out as well. All right. How do you measure risk reduction achieved due to the controls in operation? That's a little complicated, but one of the ways to do it is to say that I am going to do a set of good things. I'm going to call them the CIS controls. And then I'm going to ask myself, how much of that CIS controls do I have completed? And I say, well, I only got to 30%. Well, I've reduced my risk by 30% out of the 100% that CIS could reduce my risk. So by measuring yourself against the actual controls or good things you suggested you do. And that goes towards what you wrote in policy is actually what you're accomplishing. And so another way to measure is, I said I'd do it in policy, am I really doing it? But the risk conversation gets very complex very quickly. Any guidance for organizations that began this assessment with version 7? Version 7.1 is still a viable version of the CIS controls. And there's just a slight difference between 7 and 7.1. So move to 7.1, very easy to do. Continue to test yourself against that, get better, but have a plan towards moving to version 8 within the next 2-3 years is how I'd say that. But version 7 to version 8, reordering, refocusing, a little more focus on the implementation groups. All right. Now, a couple things we've asked about measuring how well we're doing, things like that. Well, perfect segue. We've got a couple solutions where we can assess ourselves. So there's the self-assessment tool online, cloud-based solution. You can sign up now for free. You can assess your organization. That does put it on the CIS server in the cloud, so you got to measure your risk level. If you say, hey, I only want that on premise, then you could purchase the CSAT Pro, and then you build your own server and you put it on there. If thinking about, is this sensitive data to give out? It could be, because it is an assessment of how well you're doing controls or where you have the most weakness. But you decide where you're going to put that data. So there's a solution out there. The nice thing about it is you get to answer questions and get these reports, and it gives you a lot of rich information of where that is. A couple questions came in. How do I help my CISO decide whether the CIS controls are more appropriate for our InfoSec program versus ISO, NIST, CSF, or whatever? my high level guidance is do whatever the organization is already doing. Whatever you've started on is a good idea. So if they're going towards ISO for some reason, follow through with ISO. But ISO is 27001. It says have a control framework. Normally that's 27002. That actually could be the CIS controls. So you can do ISO by doing the CIS controls. Same thing with the CSF if you're already doing something. If you don't have any framework out there, you don't know where to go, start with the CIS controls and then add in the cybersecurity framework eventually is how I would guide you through things. But that's a bigger conversation than just one question. So I don't have a perfect answer for that. And then based on the key preventative controls you outline here, what would be the key detective controls to put in place? The interesting thing is the CIS controls often start out with preventative controls, but then get into the detective controls within the same control family. So inventory of all your devices is an identify phase. Blocking it is your preventive phase with NAC, and then monitoring that would be your detective phase. I'm noticing that things are getting plugged into the network that aren't supposed to be there. So it's all built into the controls, detective and preventative, as well as identify, recover, and respond. So all of those are in there depending on the control. All right. So a couple more things just to make sure I cover it. As we go through this, there is measures and metrics. So there's a high level where we can say, hey, so first off, there's this site down here that goes into a lot of detail and really covers how to get your measurements, how to do those calculations to get something that's very meaningful. And then you have to add metric on top of this, which is just basically what is sufficient for us. So as an example, for completeness, what percentage of our current enterprise asset inventory contains the correct information? If we say that it's a low percentage, then that's going to say that we're not doing very well. High percentage, we're doing pretty well. A lot of times we might flip this and say it backwards. What percentage of the current enterprise assets do not contain necessary detailed information? And that way, the lower the percentage, if you can get to zero risk in that specific control, and then get to higher percentages, that's how much risk is left over. So number of ways to measure these things. Basically, every safeguard, 153 things we tell you to do, you should have at least one measurement for each one of those. But it might be more than one measurement. So measure how well you're doing, keep showing that back to the organization. It's actually how we show that we're getting value out of these security programs. They're always cost centers. It's expensive for security. Well, we can show how well we're doing and how many things we've stopped can be a valuable piece of information for our organization. A couple of the questions we're asking, hey, I'm already doing a different framework. Well, there's absolutely a way to map between those. CIS Navigator is the solution, and it can map between a lot of different frameworks that already exist out there. You go out to the website, you go in and say, hey, I want to do a mapping between these different frameworks. Maybe I've got to do, in this example, PCI 4.0, but I can also choose the cybersecurity framework, etc. It then shows per safeguard, does it apply to PCI in this case? And then I can export this data and bring it into my GRC platform or anywhere else that I want to show that I've gotten I've completed my compliance. I need to do PCI. I did the CIS controls. How much of PCI is completed? And you're going to find that much of PCI is completed. Well, you should get credit for that. I set a strong password for CIS. Oh, I'm supposed to have a strong password for PCI. Well, let's not do it twice. Let's just say that the one for CIS, let's make sure it meets PCI, and then we're good to go. And that's what this tool is helping us out to do. And that goes for ISO, and that goes for many other things. I think there's about 30 of them in here. We've got some Excel-based versions that go out to 65 or so different frameworks / control lists. So lots of different tools that can help us out. There's also CIS rapid or risk assessment model where you can methodology where you can do a risk assessment over time. So lots of different tools that are available to you within the ecosystem for CIS. All right. Of course, there's a course about it. I'm the author for the course, and there's some places where I am having the course in the near future. So in December, I'll be in Washington, D.C., and then in January, I will be in Amsterdam, and I think that in February, I'll be in Saudi Arabia. So all kinds of places that, just in case you're interested. And then, of course, there's the on-demand version of it. Whoops, I pressed the wrong button. So the CI this course fits into one of our triads, an operational security triad, thinking about what we should be doing to defend and keep the lights on and keep our security at the right level. And so 566 being one of those foundational courses, and then also expanding more on the vulnerability side with 516, and then our security operations becomes a really important part as well. All right. Let me go through, just show this, something coming up. Thursday, November 2nd, Cyber Compliance Countdown. So that's another summit available to us that you can get some good information. So I highly recommend that. And then that's all I have for this is question and answer. And I do have one question, but feel free to post any questions that you have. We've got about 10 minutes left in our time together. So I mentioned briefly CIS and risk measuring or measuring risk. Can I elaborate? So when we're thinking about risk, there's a few different ways to do your risk assessments. And most of us choose a list of good things to do and then test ourselves against that. In other words, we're doing gap analysis. So the CIS controls is what I choose to do today. That's what I'm suggesting to you. You choose the controls. There's 153 safeguards. Am I doing those 153 safeguards? If I say no, that's residual risk on my organization, because I said I was going to do it, but I didn't do it. Same thing with my policies. My policies say I'm supposed to have good authentication and do this and that. Am I really doing the things that are in there? That's one way to do an assessment. Another thing that you can do is look at the actual threats that are out there. Well, that's what CIS did for you. So we looked at the threats and we said, you know what, the most important things you need to do are these 153 things in this order. So you don't have to do the threat side, but you could. You could go to MITRE ATT&CK or whatever you want to do. The last thing that you have is available through the CIS ecosystem is the CIS risk assessment model, CISRAM, CIS-RAM. And CISRAM is a tool for free, an Excel-based document that you can use to do an assessment. You can actually use that as due diligence. If you do the assessment year over year and show progress, then you can actually go to a regulator or somebody and say, I know we got breached, but look at, we've been doing better and better and better every year. We really focus on this, things like that. So a few different ways that you can think about that. And then the CIS Navigator tool is on the CIS website. It's a web-based solution for you. So you'd go there, poke in the information that you want, and then export the results and take those into your organization. There are a few places. Let's see if I can say some things here. If you look at audit scripts, another SANS instructor has some resources under free resources from the audit script site. I did put that in the chat if you're interested in it. That is a place where you can get Excel-based versions of these assessments, as well as Excel-based versions of the master mapping, if you're interested in doing them that way. Another question here in the States, a lot of organizations look at NIST, either special publication or the cybersecurity framework for guidance. CIS also has their cyber performance goals. So there appear to be competition in terms of control frameworks to implement. But what about overseas? Are you finding that organizations outside of the US are favoring the CIS controls? Good question. Complex. There's a lot of standards out there, and there's actually a comic that I'll put up about this, where you look at, I see that there's 13 competing standards. None of them fit my need. I'm going to create a better one, and I create another one, and then we have 14 competing standards, right? So we have lots of these competing standards. Some of the governments outside of the United States are adopting the CIS controls by converting them into a local version. And so they'll give it a different name. It will have different wording in it, but it's kind of the CIS controls underneath, but they're translated. Some organizations are saying, hey, some governments are saying, hey, do follow the CIS controls. And there are many programs that are focusing on the CIS controls outside of the US. As far as competing solutions, absolutely. The Australian Signals Directorate have their own top 30, or sorry, their 35 mitigations, and their top essential 8 mitigations inside of that are related to the CIS controls. So a lot of comparable work. The reason for the CIS controls is this argument that we all choose these frameworks and we do a little bit of the frameworks, but we don't know which things inside the frameworks are the most important. CIS says, do this stuff first. These are the basic things. And if you do these, you're going to get credit in all those other frameworks that are out there. Because all the other frameworks want you to do very similar things. They just aren't as direct in how they say it. So we're much more prescriptive in the CIS controls versus theoretical in an ISO. An ISO is, hey, do you have a good program? What do you think about it? And you have to like choose the pieces that you want as you go through that. So just a little bit different way to focus on it. Any other questions out there? I saw a hand raised for a second. I don't think we can turn on audio, but feel free to post anything in Q&A if you are interested in that. And let me go ahead and there is an email for me if you're interested in having additional conversation. Joseph got a good question. Any estimate on when the 9.0 of the controls may be released? We were just working on a version 8.1 and we scrapped it. So there weren't enough changes to warrant putting out a minor version like that, because normally a lot of times we've been doing 6, 6.1, 7, 7.1, 8, thought about an 8.1, that did not happen. So it would probably be starting in the middle of next year, having the conversation. So another year before we'd have another version of the controls at the earliest. The conversation's out there, but we haven't started a formal, let's do something with the controls. So question, do I tend to see ISO owning this area within large corporations with incident response ensuring the controls are on the incident app? Okay, so there's a couple different ways to say ISO. So are we talking about the standard, or are we talking about an information security officer? Assuming that it's the information security officer, then yes, a chief information security officer, often above all of the organization security department, and they may choose a CIS controls. If you're in a more complex organization, you may have different organizational areas like physical locations or other areas that might choose different parts to do, and they're choosing the CIS controls. But generally, I see it selected at a higher level. I also see it as smaller organizations or less mature organizations will take the CIS controls first because they don't know where to start. More mature organizations, they've chosen a framework because of regulation, because of compliance, but they may not be doing as well with it. So that stick with those frameworks you've chosen, but maybe add the CIS controls as a bottom up. Let's make sure we have the basics in place. And then incident response is one of the controls, Control 17, and so we do want to have it in there. We don't get into how robust you would talk about it in a organization that does incident response regularly. Many organizations don't do incident response, they hire it out. And so their responsibility is declaring the incident and calling the right people. So the CIS controls don't go in as much depth then there are many organizations. So most organizations don't do a lot of incident response. Many organizations, larger organizations, targeted organizations do a lot of incident response, and they would have a much more robust solution than what CIS is talking about. All right, short of being breached, how do you encourage management to adopt CIS if remediation requires money? One of the things I would start you with is, yes, it costs money, but how many tools do you have that you only turned one feature on? And so maybe going through what we already have and saying, I've got a vulnerability assessment tool. What's the most I can do with it? Guess what? It can do compliance scans, and so it can do hardware, or sorry, secure configurations, and so finding those things. But then otherwise, if trying to show management that they need this, get it in economic terms, get risk in economic terms, look at competitors, similar businesses where breaches have happened. How much did it cost to them? How much would it cost for us if this bad thing would happen, so that they can see that the risk has a dollar value. The business is constantly thinking about risk, and they're thinking about it in economic terms. And so when we come and we say critical vulnerability ABC that just came out, move it, log4shell, whatever those things are, critical means a different thing to the business. It means I'm going out of business. That's not what's happening here. But I'm going to lose $3 million. Got it. I can compare that $3 million as a business person to some other risk that's out there. So that's my best idea. And then leveraging other breaches and similar organizations. Doing tabletop exercises inside of your incident response can be a way as well, where you're actually walking through some of that stuff. Yeah, so we're about out of time, but I just got a couple questions, so I'm going to keep going. Does 5666 cover commercial tools as well as free tools to help in applying, as well as scanning for controls benchmarks, also collaborating amongst different IT and security teams during implementation? Yes and no. We do mention some of the commercial tools and then some of the free tools. I try to be agnostic, but sometimes got to talk about the real tools that are out there. So yes, as far as collaborating, some of the tools, some of the benchmarks and things, I use Excel as that communication path. So we have some of that in there. So I do talk about it in the class. And then does CIS provide industry benchmarks on these controls, like how organizations in the industry perform against the CIS controls? Not directly inside of the MS-ISAC they do, but not to the rest of the public. And really you're getting from benchmark to a metric. So the metric is the hard part. How well am I doing with my security program? I can measure that. But what's good enough? For instance, I want you to know what's on the first control, what hardware is on your network. Are you ever going to know 100% exactly accurate what's on your network? Or are you always going to be off by like 5% because there's new devices and there's old devices that are getting put on the network or taken off the network? Someone took their computer home and closed the lid, so it's not in the inventory right now, or it's not being found right now, but it does exist. There's always these edge cases. And so in those cases, what's good enough, that's that metric, and we've got to negotiate that with the business. All right, last question, because we are over time, and then feel free to switch to email, and I will talk more about this. Will CIS ever provide sets of policies and procedures that will encompass IG1 to 3 controls to facilitate the adoption of the framework? Absolutely, they've done that. So there is a policy section where they have custom written policies specific to the CIS controls. They're going to be very high level. You're going to have to put work into them, but they give you that starting point of this is what you would do to meet this control. STANS has our own policy library. Ours is more generic. It's not specific to the CIS controls. The CIS version is specific to the controls, and you can find that just on CI security, look for the controls, and then it's in the resources on those pages. All right. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for the time. I know I went kind of quick through some of that. There's so much more. I can talk for 5 days about this. So come on down and we'll talk about it for 5 days in the class. But otherwise, feel free to hit me up with questions and things like that. I, of course, consult in this world. I do assessments as well as people with implementation. Otherwise, thank you all. I appreciate it. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and shut everything down, but good talking to you, and thank you all for your time.